We're ready?
Yeah.
Right, it is 7 o'clock. Good evening and welcome to the Rushcliffe Borough Council's Corporate Overview Group meeting. I'd like to remind everyone that the meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the Council's YouTube channel. We're not using the usual cameras and microphones for this meeting. We're using the Polycom system. Please can I remind councillors and officers to speak as clearly as they can during this meeting. In addition, under the local authorities' executive arrangements, meetings and access to information, England Regulations 2012, other people may film, record, tweet or blog on this meeting. Use of any such images or sound recordings is not under the council's control. We'll now move to item 1, which is apologies for absence.
Apologies on Councillor Burdick.
Councillor Butler said he might be just a few minutes late.
Thank you. Any declarations of interest? No. Then we'll move to the minutes of the meeting, 2nd of November, which is pages 1 to 12 in your agenda. I take it everybody has read those. Does anybody have any amendments, queries in that event? We all agree with the minutes on our side. Right, we now move to item number 4, the impact of COVID-19 on the Rushcliffe Borough Council internal focus. Can I just say to everybody, I haven't lost my place, but my agenda is half printed upside down. So I shall be scrubbling a bit to try and keep my place. So please feel free to pick me up if I've missed something, because I might well have found it on the wrong side of the page. Okay, so get the right one. Right. Agenda item 14, the COVID-19 report.
Take this down.
Thank you, Chair, for that introduction to this report, and it's I'm really pleased actually to present this report this evening. It's the first of 2 reports that we've produced, which, when you look at the topic of the COVID-19 pandemic and the council's response to it, we felt it was really important to separate out our response really into 2 different areas. The first one being our internal response, so how did we respond and react to the pandemic as an organisation, and this is what the report is in front of you this evening. And then the second report is around how our external services and how we work with community, business, and indeed how councillors actually worked within the community as well, and that'll be covered in the second report later this year. I'd like to place on record my thanks to Charlotte and Karen, who've done extensive work on this report. It is a very lengthy report, but I think a really important one to place on public record, really, the council's activities and actions within what's been really an unprecedented period. So the report starts really with an explanation of really what the emergency planning arrangements that we've got as a council. So myself, I'm a member of the exec management team, but I'm also the lead respondent for emergency planning. So I work closely with colleagues from within the local resilience forum across Nottinghamshire. I'm supported by Karen Emery, who's the emergency planning officer for the council. The report then details some context. If I can remember that far back before the pandemic, we were busy dealing with some flooding at the time, and we were already in sort of emergency mode, if you like, at that time. We had a number of very significant flooding impacts across the borough. And then all of a sudden, then we found ourselves actually within the grip of the pandemic. So how did we respond to that pandemic when it happened in lockdown in March 2020 is detailed in the report, and how we actually activated the council's emergency plan. And basically that puts the whole organisation on a completely different footing from normal day-to-day work. The second element of the report details around how the impact on the council staff, how we actually put into place what at the time we thought was temporary measures in terms of internal management arrangements and reporting arrangements. So we actually had a really close handle on what work was coming into the organisation, how we needed to respond in those first few weeks. We also had some significant impacts in terms of staff absence and indeed some impacts on workload as well, and they're detailed within the report. We then move on to different aspects of the council services. So interestingly, I think it probably falls into three camps really. Some services such as our colleagues in community facilities that were effectively closed, and those colleagues were redeployed. We had some colleagues who ended up seeing more of their normal work, so such as planning, for example. So during the pandemic, we've identified and seen a big increase in planning applications as people are looking to create more space and enjoy their home, obviously during what's been a difficult period. And the third area of impact probably is in those services such as environmental health and finance, who've had to respond to significant increases in workload through grants or enforcement or whatever, so as well as doing their existing workload. We also cover it within the report, the impact on the council's projects. As you know, we've got an aspirational project plan for the organisation, which has had some impacts. We've managed to mitigate them wherever possible, but you'll be well aware of issues around the supply chain. You know, so in terms of some of our build projects at the arena, at Bingham, and indeed, you know, looking ahead to the crematorium, a strong thought there. Then, you know, some of those supply chain issues, you know, we're working hard to make sure they're mitigated as we move forward to deliver those projects. We've also put together what we believe are some critical success factors. What are the things that we did that were really positive that made a difference? We've detailed those, you know, within the report, and hopefully, you know, we look forward to your comments and views on those critical success factors. And finally, the report concludes really with some reflections on lessons learned. As always, within a situation like this, and certainly in the emergency planning world, it's really important after an emergency event that you take time to reflect on your response. Could it have been different? How could it be better? I think the challenge with the COVID pandemic has been that every time we thought we were coming out of it and moving into the lessons learned phase, we ended up going back into it. So we oscillated between response and recovery and back into response again. And it was that yo-yoing impact, which I think has made, you know, A, the report a lot longer, but also B, it's made it, you know, interesting to try and sort of capture some of those lessons learned. We'll also be looking to feed back into work of the Local Resilience Forum as well, because there will be some lessons learned, as you can imagine, on a wider footprint across Nottinghamshire as well. So I think that probably summarises the report, but happy to take any questions, you know, and support your work this evening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Banks. Yes, let me also endorse my thanks to the officers who obviously have put in an awful lot of hard work, and the staff. Not just now, but during the pandemic, obviously. But yes, a lot of work has obviously gone into this report, which I think is very valuable report. And I would ask you, you said a lot of lessons learned. Are there going to be any alterations to the council's emergency plan?
I think the emergency plan is one of those generic documents. It's designed to be deployed when an emergency situation arises, and when we believe that, you know, there's a significant situation occurring within the borough that requires to put the council on that different footing. Often that's done in tandem with a decision within the Local Resilience Forum as well. So I think actually our emergency plan stood us in good stead. I'm not anticipating to make any changes to the emergency plan. I think it's fit for purpose. I think some of the other plans that we've looked at, so for example, across the local resilience one, we did have a pandemic flu plan, and we also had our own version of that as well. I think, again, that provided a useful basis to support decision making around how do you deal with a viral pandemic. But it clearly needed a lot of tweaking in the eyes of, obviously, you know, the COVID-19, which was a completely different situation to probably what the pandemic flu thought it would be like. As you've probably heard a lot during the pandemic, you know, COVID-19 didn't come with a handbook. You know, we had to do an awful lot of learning on the hoof and work with colleagues across the county council, in particular, obviously the Director of Public Health, Jonathan Griffin, at the county council, who chaired the tactical coordinating group. You know, we had to flex that or create, if you like, our own COVID-19 plan as part of our, you know, within the pandemic, rather than actually arriving at, as we would do so with flooding. We've got a flood plan. It's, you know, we know what happens in the flooding. We know exactly where it should flood generally, in terms of surface water and river and course flooding. You know, our knowledge of that is much deeper, whereas in this situation, you know, that wasn't the case.
Okay. If council will allow me, there's just one other question, or something that I think we should look at. It says that at item 4.18, a small number of officers did not have broadband connections at home or lived in areas of poor connectivity. I think, and this will come out probably in the next report, that not only were officers impacted by poor broadband and mobile connections, but the whole of the borough, the children, the health service, everybody. And that would lead me to say, I can't remember what year it was we did it, but should we be bringing broadband back to scrutiny? Because I think I cannot believe it. I was at a meeting in Weissel Village Hall as the company I Need Broadband came in to install broadband connection. Well, I Need Broadband is not like the BT, Ofcom, or whatever it is, broadband service. And I said, you telling me you can't get broadband? That's, isn't it? So I think this highlights very much our need to do something further about that. So having said that a little bit.
Yeah, I think just on that point, Joe, I think, you know, 4.18, it does really illustrate how well placed we were as an organisation, you know, in terms of the work that we've done in terms of moving to the arena, and how many colleagues had already been set up with laptops and so on. So really, you know, a decision could be made that the afternoon to say, actually, you know, a significant proportion of the organisation be going to work from home now. Actually, we could do that, whereas some organisations and local authorities couldn't do that because staff had, you know, tower PCs and fixed terminals, etc., on their own desks. So the agility of our organisation, the work that we've done in advance of the pandemic, really stood us in good stead and allowed us to be on the front foot. But you're quite right. I mean, it did reveal perhaps some parts of the borough where frankly, you know, the broadband isn't quite as good as it should be, and people were sort of having to perhaps hotspot to mobiles or be rather innovative, shall we say, in terms of how they worked. But yeah, I'm sure, you know, I'm sure Charlotte will be sort of capturing that as an opportunity, perhaps to bring that back to presumably the community scrutiny group at some point again to see where we are, you know, in terms of the borough picture on broadband.
Yeah, I think we have to acknowledge that. Well, in my view, as a council, we have managed this pandemic very well. I think we are an exemplary council. But as like I said, does anyone have anything they wish? Councillor Gray.
I'd like to say thank you. I mean, this is a very, very detailed, thoughtful report. I think it takes it took me back reading through it to moments in the pandemic. Remembering fondly, actually, as everyone was getting to grips with the virtual meetings, and I had a notification on my phone saying Rushcliffe was live, and I tuned in to find senior management team and some others wearing sombreros, fez, and Hawaiian shirts. So I cheerfully said something in the chat, and it was Councillor Grave in the chat, and then I disappeared. It was no longer live. So I think that was some early testing that didn't mean to be live. As I read through that pop back.
You know where the MT meetings are. It's all high profile stuff.
So it was interesting in that, and actually I think it's very good looking through and seeing some of the things that are pulled out there. I think particularly things like the red umbrella for mental health service in there, and actually the virtual coffee for homeschoolers, I think again shows that the council sort of really thought about the well-being of staff within this time. Looking through on and thinking of a couple of questions on this, I think on 425 mentions that with flexible working and some other points that the staff have been looked after on this, but also that there hasn't been perhaps these softer forms of recognition may not be enough moving forward. So whether we would look to to recognise the extremely hard work and actually the adaptation shown within the council in this time, I think to hang on to the best staff and people that have adjusted so well, maybe we are going to be looking at financial forms of recognition for this work. And I suppose how would we do that is a question. Also looking towards 4.44, it mentions the response to homelessness, where we had the everybody in. And in that time, we homed 39 homeless and another 9. And so my question on that is what happened after that, and where are those people now? If there were good outcomes for those people having been in the system at that point. Those are my initial thoughts and questions.
So in terms of the sort of rewards and so on, I think one of the things that we've tried to do in terms of the learnings from the pandemic is really capture what was good about our response, really, and build that into the organisation. So now that we're sort of we've moved back to Plan A, we are looking at encouraging staff to remain connected with the organisation. So that means working in the arena once or twice a week. That allows us to continue to engage and connect with colleagues. And I think that kind of environment is something that will help us. That flexibility will allow us to continue to attract and indeed retain, talented people. We have sought with Kath's support, there's been some remuneration, if you like, for people who've taken on extra roles and responsibilities and duties as well. So, we've tried to be really, supportive and make sure actually, we have recognised people. It's not always possible financially, but simply to, through some thank you, through the staff awards, and we do like sort of staff comments thing whereby people can say thank you to each other. Those sorts of mechanisms have been really powerful, and even things such as down at the depot, at Eastcroft there, where we had a whole wall full of residents' feedback, which I have to say has been hugely powerful, very impactful in terms of staff down there. They've really sort of ridden, a real crest of the wave really in terms of the focus I think the pandemic put on the importance of waste collection. Because often that service is just taken for granted, but I think the pandemic shone a spotlight on some of those really critical, essential public health services, and it was great to see. So it's those sorts of non-material rewards, if you like, that actually I think have had a really positive impact. In terms of the homeless side of things, it's been great actually to see how much support we've had from the government, in terms of crowdfunding and so on to support everybody in, and that allowed us to offer bed and breakfast type accommodation to people and respond to that, and that was taken up. we then moved those people on to different types of accommodation because it's a starting point generally for a journey, you know, rather than actually, you know, hopefully going in and then going out again, as you say. It's then, you know, how do we then support them through framework predominantly, but also housing options to encourage them to, you know, take a different path and to seek and get the support that's out there to then get into move on accommodation, which, you know, is a challenge, and we've worked with other councils to create some move on accommodation for people and use some of that government grant to do that. But yeah, you know, it always remains an ongoing challenge for us. But I have to say, our numbers of sleeping homeless people are very low. But you know, one's too many, isn't it? You know, so it's a constant area of work for us.
Yes, I think one shouldn't view pandemic as something favourable. But I think in many ways it maybe gave the opportunity to communicate better with those homeless people. They found themselves in the same position as everybody else, impacted by the virus, and therefore probably more willing to communicate with people. It gave the council that opportunity for helping and support. Whether that will continue once we are fully out of the virus situation remains to be seen. But it may well do, because it may be for them it's a good news story.
Yeah, absolutely, Chair. I think you know we continue to monitor the housing numbers very closely. More people in temporary accommodation, so on, and I think that's going to be an important sort of legacy issue throughout the recovery as we move into a whole phase of living with COVID. And the government, I think in March, are looking to release their plan about the living with COVID plan, and I think you know people. Supporting people who are emerging from the pandemic and making sure that actually, you know, they don't lose homes and have guidance, support and advice is going to be really crucial going forwards.
Councillor Mansell, I think you're.
That's right. Thank you, Chair. Just going to echo a couple of things. 4.63, the ability to move the whole workforce work from home. I know it's been mentioned before, but I think that is fantastic. And I say it because I know organisations that struggled really did. And just to highlight Microsoft Teams, very undervalued, I think. And it's great to have a central repository system, Teams, the whole Microsoft Office suite, everybody could use, and councillors as well. I think that's really, really good. So I just want to go on record saying well done to IT for making sure they did that, because I think that's planned later on, but they got that done. Just a question as well then. So on 4.7, your last lessons learned, the lesson they learned, consideration is to be given to rotation of staff in key roles to avoid burnout. I'm glad that's recognised, because I can only imagine the amount of pressure, work, no holidays, etc. Would we be able to do something like that, even though, I know this has come out from a pandemic, but just continuing monitoring the well-being of staff, because I can appreciate in a hybrid environment, once again, if you're working from home, you're probably working longer hours than you anticipate. Coming in, I think is great, having those face-to-face meetings, but I think it's important to kind of monitor, maybe not necessarily burnout, but especially the well-being of staff.
Yeah, absolutely, Chair. You know, and I think, you know, we, I think that was one of the reasons really why some organisations, my neighbour, for example, has moved permanently to work at home. And I think that might be right for that organisation, but I think we want to remain a connected organisation whereby we've got to see people, as I say, you know, once or twice a week, to have that connectivity and engagement, and also make sure that we have got a framework in place to manage people both in the office and indeed remotely as well, because that's, you know, that requires a different style of management and approach, and that isn't just about, you know, the work output, but it's around looking at the whole individual, you know, making sure that as an organisation we care about the whole individual and their well-being, and as I said, we've got a number of different, just, you know, the gym membership, if you like, and all that kind of stuff, but the training, the red umbrella sessions. You know, we've got a whole raft of different support measures there to help people if indeed they need that. But yeah, you know, we think that it is important that you know, looking at what that was driving at was that when you normally most of your planning responses last for a few weeks. So it's not such a problem, if you like, to have key individuals involved with attending meetings and doing their existing work as well as all the emergency planning stuff. But I think you know, we've put a number of senior colleagues on courses, emergency planning courses, to allow that rotation. So, for example, for a number of months, we had colleagues covering the recovery coordinating group as well as the tactical coordinating group. Because, you know, if I was to go to everything, then I probably would have, you know, burnt out. But by splitting and devolving roles and responsibilities and using, you know, the talent that we've got across the organisation, that's been really beneficial, and we'll look to do more of that, I think, going forwards, so that knowledge is spread, you know, across a number of colleagues, really. So, yeah, it's definitely something. Say, you know, we've identified it there as a key lesson learned, but I think it'll come up in lots of different ways, as you described.
Thank you.
Councillor Clark?
Thank you. The report is a very comprehensive report, what we mentioned is very detailed, and so yeah, everybody needs to be congratulated. The response to the pandemic was amazing. I mean, this is full of, I was going to say it's full of good news, that's probably not accurate, it's full of positivity. It's probably better to, I don't know whether the pandemic is good news or not, but it's certainly positive. I just wondered if I could just, there are more questions of curiosity probably rather than challenge as such. Level of PPE, did we get that about right? Have we got a PPE mountain, or are we devoid of PPE? I agree with your comments about the flooding. Yeah, I mean, you're deep in reacting to a very serious flooding event, and then suddenly you're into dealing with pandemic. I think really that what that does illustrate is how much the pandemic has been, as you mentioned, a steep learning curve, but it's made everybody very quickly have to learn new skills and new ways of working, and how to muck in probably with each other a lot more in order to get things done and keep the services rolling. Just a query on 4.13 and 4.14. What does stood up mean? I'm not quite sure what that's about. I think you've talked about home working, so I won't repeat that, other than to say I think home working is absolutely fine, and I agree with people adapting and working from home, but I think we do still have to bear in mind and keep in mind the one thing you lose by having home working and virtual meetings is everything becomes too formal and specific, and you lose the corridor conversations and the coffee machine conversations, which sometimes are just as important, and it's sometimes you can highlight something and say, oh yeah, we'll get something done on that, whereas you wouldn't in a formal virtual meeting. So I do think that coming into the office still has its place. Workload, oh yes, talk about the levels of household waste, and probably the chairman of the Environment Committee of the County Council might be interested in this as well. Just in terms of how have you been able to cope with the waste collections, because I think you've had a lot of issues, well, the whole country did, with driver availability. How successful were you in being able to weather that storm? And is the level of fly tipping increasing as a result of the pandemic? And that's the other thing I was going to find out, the two things. you talked about hygiene at the depot and the cleansing of the vehicles. Did that mean that the insides of the vehicles got sort of like a deep clean as well, in order, obviously, to try and prevent passing on? And planning workload, 40% increase in applications. I don't know whether you can answer this. It's probably something we need to be asking the planning officers, I suspect. But there was an increase in the level of time for consultees, etc. I'm just wondering how much did that have a big impact? I think councillors noticed it, but from the outside world, did that have a big impact in terms of applicants?
Which
The 4.45.
there's a lot of that.
Yes, I appreciate it. It's probably not your province, and we maybe need to ask them the planning department second. But really, I think we absolutely need to be giving very hearty thanks to everybody in the organisation. As I say, looking in and continuing the good work.
Chair, just to respond to those points. So, working from the top, PPE. PPE, we were quite fortunate actually. We had a reasonable amount of PPE in stock. We were then well supported by the logistics cell, which was set up under the technical coordinating group that operated across the county council and basically provided PPE for all organisations, including social care, obviously in a priority order. And obviously at some points it was very critical for social care. You know, and I think back to probably the beginning of the pandemic when probably there were some concerns about availability and things were quite tight. It was quite sort of hand to mouth, if you like, whereby stocks were arriving just in the nick of time. But I think quite quickly, you know, the whole supply chain just sort of geared up, if you like, and that's perhaps some of the decision making that happened at a national level, which then started to filter down to local level. And you know, after a few months, I think things really settled down, and we've been really fortunate in terms of availability of PPE throughout the rest of the pandemic. So we've been very fortunate on that. And frankly, I suppose our usage of PPE is a lot lower than some organisations because we just don't have the kind of services that need that. So, for example, domestic care, that kind of thing. So that's been a really positive story generally, PPE. Yeah, in terms of flooding events and so on, and I think one of the things that we have learned throughout it is to try and manage concurrent risks better. So, during the pandemic, we ended up with also a significant potential risk to fuel. So we set up another coordinated group to manage fuel shortage, which again, so you've got multiple risks happening to the organisation. How do we manage those risks?
Unforeseen consequences.
Yeah, and how do we make sure we don't, reduce service delivery and compromise, the quality of services to the public. So that's been a real challenge, and probably another learning point, really, how we've been able to do that. 4.13 stood up basically means activated. It just means that it's sort of emergency planning language for making something, standing something up and activating an organisation or a cell. Emergency planning comes with its whole world of special language. In terms of waste tonnages, yeah, we've seen a significant increase in waste tonnage. Certainly both on grey residual waste and indeed dry recycling as well, and it's been pretty heavy as well. With obviously people spending more time at home and generating more waste at home. It's seen more frequent visits to the disposal points, so that's made days longer for colleagues. And then quite soon then we started to see, if you like, the issues around HGV drivers coming through, as there was other critical areas, if you like, needing to absorb more drivers. Right, then that put a pressure obviously on us as an organisation. We did respond to that, which was well publicised in terms of increasing providing a financial incentive to our HGV drivers, which had a positive impact. And it remains, I think, an improving picture. I think there's been an awful lot of work done again nationally on trying to speed up the training of HGV drivers. Where we've put, I think we've got 2 or 3 at the moment of loaders that have been put through their paces into becoming HGV drivers. So we're really big on growing our own drivers. We've always been keen on it, but we've really sort of put greater emphasis on that. And then things have got a little bit better in terms of the actual testing arrangements for HGV drivers as well, which has helped smooth things over as well. So
Can I just this if I may, the training of the people into HGV, do we pay for it, and does that come with a lock-in for a minimum employment period?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Or presumably they then have to reimburse.
Yes, quite. Yeah. So there's some sort of it's a commitment, isn't it? We're supporting the individual to go on a journey and increase their technical skills, and we want to make sure we make best use of them. So yes, that's correct. In terms of fly tipping's been an oddly positive story. I think the impact of WISE has been really profound, and the work that they've been doing in terms of investigating fly tips, and we've seen a reduction in fly tipping over this last year, and a sustained sort of reduction in terms of those monthly data, which is really positive. We hope it's a sustained trend, and time will tell on that. But I think that combination of the work of WISE in terms of enforcement activity, the responsive service of Streetwise of picking fly tipping up, so we don't get the broken windows syndrome of fly tipping being left out there, and encouraging even more. And indeed, sort of education and hard-hitting campaigns to encourage people to take ownership of their waste and do the right thing with it and stop lighting the countryside with it. I think has started to have an impact on people. Not taking an easy route or looking at Facebook for somebody who might be able to get rid of some rubbish. Look out for all those key messages, making sure you're using somebody who's got a waste carrier's license. Check it out, because otherwise it's your waste, and we might end up having to issue a duty of care fine on you for doing that. Those messages, I think, are getting out there, and we're seeing a reduction in fly tipping as a result. Hygiene at the depot, so that was a service that we brought in via Streetwise, actually. So we had cleansing colleagues who were cleaning, similar to our facilities colleagues in here in the arena. It's an increased level of hygienic cleaning going on in terms of touch points and so on, and that hopefully helped to prevent the spread of the virus. And in terms of the planning workload, that's one that I might not be able to answer, and I think we might need Charlotte to make a note of that one. Take that one away.
I've made a note, but I can also say that it's one that I brought up with Leanne before the meeting. And what she came back with is, of course, people that we consult with, for example, the Environment Agency, County Council, such like, we're having the same problems as we were having, as any organisation was having, with levels of sickness and staff being more remote. So there was a knock-on effect of people not being available to deal with those consultations. Your question specifically related to whether the public will notice that. I don't think they did, but I think it was tied up in everything else that was going on at the time. And of course, things are now getting much better and back to normal in terms of those deadlines.
Chairman, can I just ask one? Has the level of litter reduced? Has there been a noticeable reduction in generally litter around the place?
It's an odd one, this Chair, because it also went through a cycle, really, whereby suddenly we saw some quite significant increases in litter, particularly when during certain periods of the pandemic, where we saw a lot of the parks and open spaces very heavily used and sadly very heavily littered, and that was a real significant problem for some periods of the pandemic. And then, of course, we had the increase as well in PPE being disposed. Lots of, you've probably seen it for yourself, all the blue masks everywhere, and even some of the cotton ones that have fallen out people's pockets. So I think it's sort of seen up and down, really, the cycle. in terms of litter. And we hope that, you know, as we come out, you know, in terms of plan A and moving forwards, that, you know, we'll see a return to more normality, shall we say, and people taking more responsibility for litter. But yeah, you know, some of the parks, it was really quite dreadful, actually. We had to put in some really special measures to tackle that.
Just before I pass on to Councillor Butler, can I just ask, you talked about levels of hygiene and cleansing, etc. Are we going to maintain those high standards? Because yes, we have a pandemic at the moment and a virus, but we live with viruses all the time. I just think we as a nation, we needed to up the cleansing, particularly of public areas where people are holding rails. I mean, when I was a child, we always wore gloves. We don't do that anymore. But I do think the reduction in colds and flu, okay, isolating, etc. But I do think there is a reduction in colds and flu, and I think that's down to higher standards of hygiene.
I would agree with you, Chair. I think the also hand washing, you know, people's focus on how to wash your hands properly and the frequency of hand washing has been, again, another crucial factor in terms of reducing disease transmission. So all those messages hopefully have sort of landed and people have assimilated those, and they're now part of, you know, normal day-to-day living. But as well as that, yeah, we will be looking to continue with some of the additional sort of fencing measures and touch points. So exactly, you know, and I think people have got into some new habits, I think, around that, which are probably beneficial.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Well, quite a few points have been covered, but the report, as colleagues have said, is long and detailed, and quite right so, because there's a danger now, the world we're in now, the COVID world, is the new normal. And this report tells us so much, but I think as well as being a scrutiny council report, this needs to go down in history, because in 10, 20, 30, 50 years' time, when we're looking at people looking back, this is what happened during the last 2 years. And if anybody out there asks what do councils do, or what does Rushcliffe do, this is a very good example as to just what we do. And as colleagues said, everyone involved has been congratulated with so many whammies. And also there's things in here as well that we've possibly already forgotten. The Storm Dennis, for example. I mean, we're talking about Storm, the ones we just had the other day, which is on everyone's mind. But yeah, in 2 years ago, we had all these floods, and so yeah, so well done to everyone on this report. I was going to touch on the planning, but you've got the answer for that. I would dare to disagree slightly that it's getting back to normal, because I do know that there are still issues in planning, delays in decisions. Only today I've had a query from someone who first raised a query back in October last year, and we all thought it would be dealt with, and some said, "Oh no, we've not done it." But it's not just pandemics, of course. We know there's a shortage of planning officers and all the rest. So again, it's another one of these ones. But going to where we are on the list, we've done a huge amount of Rushcliffe ourselves, but there is reference to the local resilience forum where we work with the authorities. Now, because we, the borough, the county, all the other districts have been so busy doing what we do, has there been an opportunity, or do you think there will be an opportunity where you'll be able to sort of share experiences, what went well, what didn't go well, should we do this like X, Y, Z council and so on? Has there been an opportunity to do that yet, or do you think there will be? Because we're now living in shared experiences and practice and all that. So perhaps there's an opportunity there. And I think, without being too sort of blowing trumpets, I think if other councils would agree, they'd probably learn a lot from. So anyway, how we work.
Thank you. So yeah, thank you for the comments about the report. I think we felt, you know, as officers, that it was important to sort of place this on public record.
Absolutely.
Really, and I think that was great to hear, you know, feedback this evening about, you know, the scrutiny group doing the same work. It does, absolutely. But yeah, in terms of the actual local resilience forum, there has been some learning reflection, as I said, I mentioned already, but it was sort of quickly halted because it happened about the time before we went, because we were in recovery before we went into response again. So it wasn't fully conducted. So I have a feeling, having spoke to Rob Fisher, the manager council, that we will be looking to revisit this again, I think, with sort of fresh eyes, as a collective LRF, to say, actually, you know, what have we learned, you know, within Nottinghamshire, but also Rob also shares information, obviously, with other LRFs in the region. So across the East Midlands region, actually, there might be other interesting practice that we can observe and reflect upon. And indeed, you know, during the pandemic, there was some bits of information that were flowing. You know, Lincolnshire did a really good plan, you know, for this. Let's share that, you know, with Nottinghamshire, etc. So there's been, you know, huge sort of learning taking place, but also, you know, the LRF also has included colleagues in the health sector as well, so you can imagine in the NHS and social care and so on. You know, they again have also been conducting their own learning arrangements as well, and also looking to how we can sort of work better together. I think because one of the positives, if you like, from the pandemic actually is how actually we have worked across Nottinghamshire and indeed across the public sector. So health and social care, working more closely with local authorities, has been a really positive outcome in terms of building those relationships and looking at more efficient and effective ways of working. So I think, again, that's something that we'll be taking forward across the system.
Yes, well, it will be interesting to see how this, without wishing to be a prophet of doom, I suspect that if we've had a crisis with COVID and storms, there will no doubt be more crises of various kinds in the future. I hope not, but at least let's hope we're we were in a fairly good position before, but let's hope we're in a better position should something else happen. Thank you.
Councillor Wheeler.
Thank you. I just briefly, I think first of all on the point about broadband, I think we one of our employees is I'm lucky enough to be in the 1.8% of households across Nottinghamshire that haven't got super broadband. There are voucher schemes that the government and council have done to get upgraded infrastructure in the short term to help perhaps if they haven't already applied. Something to we've got there to encourage them to do that. My main point around businesses, I think, just the partnering with the thanks to the Borough Council for the stern work they've done with businesses, because you know I spoke to quite a few businesses in my county and borough division. Actually, they were Lifeline, and also the speed that came out there, the communication when you compare to some other areas across our neighbouring boroughs, which they were back city on the money or didn't see it, we get out there quick enough, wasn't acceptable. And I think coming out of the pandemic, that's one of our key learnings about communication businesses. So for example, like these hubs have been set up, and I spoke to a couple of businesses in my area, and they didn't know about these from the being set up, so they help encourage businesses to practice. Now we've got all the data from the business on the content about the grants, we're trying to actively out there encourage them to sign up to these, business forum, where it's these groups within trying to help them recover, because especially a lot of small businesses might not have that expertise to get themselves back up going again. They're just trying to fight the fire, so to speak, and keep afloat, trying to get that recovery, because we've already really strong business, especially Central Avenue and all this around there. So we want to keep that going. I think that's one of our strong points. So thanks.
Yeah, just on that point, thank you for that. You know, the second report that we're going to carry out for this will sort of look at that external focus. So that will really major on the work that we did in terms of engaging and supporting businesses, residents, etc. The voluntary sector, of course, we're not touched on. So I think the point, as you say, is really, and we'll explain more a bit about how we work with businesses and tell the story, like part 2 of the COVID response, when we start to look out to the business and the voluntary sector and indeed residents. So and we can pick up on that point that you just raised within the second report.
Right, well, I think, yes, this whilst it was bad news, that was good news report. We have the recommendations before us. However, what I feel we ought to possibly say in recommendation C, he was asking us to consider whether any actions are necessary at this stage in light of the increased knowledge and understanding the group now has about the council's response to the pandemic. I appreciate the agenda is available to everybody on the extranet. But I think, I don't know if everybody agrees with me, but maybe we should be putting this out to the councillors as a separate document for them to read. As Councillor Butler has said, it's full of information, but it's also history in the making. And there may be some comments that come back from that, which we could probably feedback and action.
I probably think some things that people say, oh, I didn't know I'd even done that.
Exactly.
This is it.
Exactly. So if we could put that in as one of our recommendations, that this is circulated in a separate item, and that we want a response back from other councillors, we all agree with that. The other thing I think we possibly has come out of this that we need to add is that we need to look at bringing broadband back to scrutiny as a result of the item already mentioned that. So I think it's 4.1. When was it? 4.18. But will no doubt be enhanced by the second report we get on community.
On that basis, do you want to leave it until you've seen the second report before including that?
Well, I think we need to put it in as a recommendation that as a result of this report, we should be looking at it, but also add that you know that information.
And the point I make sure is what do you want the report to look at in terms of broadband? Obviously, it's a county service out there. And I know the coverage is extremely good for us. There are some isolated pockets, which again, as I referred to, but as you said, there's what the county doing. I just want to understand what the items would be. I'm more happy to have an agenda, but what actually.
Well, yes, we need to look at it, we need to scrutinise it, we need to apply pressure to the suppliers and to the county. Yes, we've supplied broadband to, I forget what the percentage is, but there is still that 0.2% who are still deprived. And in 2022, we shouldn't have anybody who's deprived.
I agree. I just said that there is a lot. So I think that, like I say, one thing that's fine. I'm just saying what we actually want to get out of it. Like I said, the government has put in £210 million worth of funding to bridge that out the county as well. But the same as in a couple of years, if I remember correctly, it's going to be 100% coverage, but it's forecast to be. So there's a lot of work. But maybe it's a report or an update first, and if you want to scrutinise from there. I'm just conscious of a lot of items, especially if we see tonight on the scrutiny matrix. I want to talk about something that's actually we can actually affect the borough council, rather than just talk about something we don't have control over.
But also, I think our public need to know that we are aware of this, and this is what we are doing, and we're attempting to do on their behalf. I don't think we can just sit and ignore it. Just because we say we've done something and there are vouchers there, we don't just say that's it, job's done. We've got to keep knocking on the door, and government needs to know. Maybe from the scrutiny we say, we go back to government, we lobby government. That will come out in scrutiny.
I think Councillor Wood is right, that it's got to be done in conjunction with how because the county council has been party to driving the broadband. So we need to make sure we're liaising the information from them so that it becomes a coordinated approach rather than a confrontational approach.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, perhaps help on that. I mean, obviously, you recall committee development scrutiny group. That's a really excellent presentation from the county council officers about broadband rollout programme and exploring, what areas of the borough were still at the time, which were going to be which were in the next phase, etc. So it's been really helpful actually just to shine a spotlight on that particular topic. But as I say, we've been really grateful with the support from county council officers to attend, and hopefully if you decide to include that item as a scrutiny matrix again, then we'll be looking certainly to get colleagues from the county to come along again and provide us with what the latest picture is and indeed what the future looks like for broadband across the borough.
Without running into the danger of doing scrutiny on broadband now, this is always so dangerous when you start talking about it, but we get very fixated about the likes of BT and broadband. But more and more people now are working remotely on mobile phones. Is there scope to include on any future broadband scrutiny, not just your fixed line systems, but your mobile network companies?
I think I did actually say mobile
Did you?
connectivity.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. Yeah. Because yes, they're doing scrutiny
Yeah.
now, but
That's
I'm very concerned about mobile connectivity,
Yeah.
particularly in rural areas. The farmers working in fields who have an accident and haven't got a signal on their mobile phone. So they both connectivity needs to be. All right, so we're happy with the recommendations. With
Well,
those
Chairman,
additions.
can I just say that I mean, the word considered is not right. And I think we should be saying welcome yes, the information provided by officers.
Yes,
Because our recommendation is not to consider anything, that's what we're doing. I would have thought also, I don't know if it's appropriate at this stage to include it. I appreciate the officers going to put this in recommendations. It's incumbent on us to maybe include something about congratulating and thanking everybody in the organisation for their
response.
their response to the crisis and how everybody has adapted. In many cases, gone well beyond what they were required to do originally in order to keep the services going. But basically, what I'm saying is we need to congratulate and thank everybody in the organisation.
Yes, I agree with that. Yes, and put it in the recommendations. I was hoping it was going to be limited. We said it repeatedly, and I'm hoping it's limited.
It's minuted, and I know that Ed is typing furiously in the corner because I've asked him to bring to staff's attention this report when we do our staff newsletter at the end of the week, on the basis that we thought you would want to pass your thanks on.
Right.
It's
Okay.
a glossy version.
Some pictures in.
Yeah, well, no. I think it's suitable for people to take a look and read.
I think, Chair, as well, it's incumbent at the fact that part of that as well actually was the excellent support we had from councils as well. So I think it was definitely a two-way street.
Yes,
Yes, well done,
Oh, aren't we a jolly
It's so civilised.
Right, okay. Well, moving on, we now go to the right place here. Item 5, finance performance management. All change.
As I usually do, I was going to say I'm not going to do it. So as usual, I'll run through the finance part of the report and then go to the performance. So this report starts on, I think, page 49 of the pack. It's the position to the end of September. And again, as per the quarter one report, it includes variances. And again, just to reiterate that our budgets, when we set them, we did anticipate an adverse impact from COVID, around 20% on these again, that these have recovered a lot quicker than we anticipated. So the table at table 4.2 summarises the position with net costs of 129k from COVID, with savings from funds of 845k also, which gives us a net of 716,000. We have some non-ring-fence grant funding of 36k, and Appendix B details the variances, the most significant of which are planning income and interest earned on investments. Business rates are expected currently to result in a surplus of just over 3 million. However, just under 1.8 million of this needs to be appropriated to reserves to the anticipated deficit that will arise next year and the year after as a result of additional use that were given to businesses at the start of the year. Paragraph 4.3 details some further commitments, namely the Broadband golf course feasibility study and a 1 million recommendation to full council within the medium-term financial strategy for vehicle replacement reserve, and also 100,000 to the strategic overhauls, 50k for feasibility in Central Avenue, and 35,000 for the improvement board. Appendix A summarises the revenue position, which is a net £673,000 efficiency saving. Paragraph 4.5 and Appendix E shows the position currently on special expenses. As reported last month, this is also affected by COVID, and we have portioned some of the sales fees and charges funding we've got for Q1 to help offset some of the losses, the lost income that we've had from facilities within there. This results in a net deficit of 10k currently. Paragraphs 4.7 and 4.8 summarise the capital position, which is currently projected as a 10.2 million underspend, the largest of which is the Bingham Hall Crematorium, which will be carried forward into next year. Appendixes C and D provide further detail on these schemes, which includes an acceleration of 40,000 into 21-22 play areas. Paragraph 4.9 again just reconfirms the position Q1 that we are unlikely to borrow due to the current projections. Paragraph 4.10, 4.16 updates on the COVID issues that we've been doing throughout the COVID period. Sales fees and charges claims submitted at 18k. That is for Q1 only, so we won't get any of that for the rest of the year. Table 2 shows the grants that we've had so far and we're not anticipating anymore. The multi-asset or diversified funds that we've got our investments in have reported just over 1.2 million at the start of the COVID period and lost value. That's now recovered and is now above the pre-COVID levels. So in conclusion, the position currently is positive, but there are still risks of further restrictions. We've got cost increases and funding uncertainty. And so it's important that we remain financially resilient. There's also a lot of uncertainty still with business rates, fair funding, as well as opportunities with the Freeport and Development Corporation. So we need to closely monitor the position to ensure that we're resilient going forward.
Good evening, Chair, Councillors. Moving on to performance, if I can refer to Appendix G that covers many aspects of things, data to give a bit more clarity. Strategic scorecard summary table shows 14 performance exceptions. 8 of these were covered in the course of 1 report in November. We discussed as appropriate, so I may not cover these in as much depth, but please, of course, highlight anything you wish to raise. As we heard this evening's COVID performance, some of these measures have been impacted by lockdown and change in resident behaviours as a result of COVID, as much as COVID affected indicators are no longer subject to the special reports that were introduced in 2021. If we address first the indicators that we discussed at last week's community scrutiny group on those relating to the resident survey, I'm not sure if Councillor Wheeler, as chair, may wish to give me steer on that shortly, particular points. But moving on first to percentage of residents believing the council provides value for money, and the pandemic impacted upon feelings of resident satisfaction, I'm never sure, across many areas, and it's a picture that's replicated nationally. Among the feedback taken away from the meeting last week was to continue to educate residents about the role of the council as the collection authority, how council tax is distributed, and other key parts of the public sector for services, not just run for the council. Similarly, the percentage of residents satisfied in a variety of ways and contact the council has also been addressed with the group. There was a wider discussion on how the council continue to engage with forthcoming customer service and communication strategies that are being finalised this spring. Moving on then to the percentage of residents satisfied with cleanliness, appearance of parks and open spaces. Performance data based on inspections of these areas is positive, well within targets set for performance within the contract. And for the percentage of household waste that's in for reuse, recycling, composting, and the number of pavilion, community hall and playground users, there are again signs of positivity. We've not a significant change for Q1 that we discussed in November, particularly on household waste. More residents have worked from home. It's because of the recent Plan B measures, more waste that's created. But on the other side, venue usage was impacted throughout 2021. Habits are re-emerging now that the bookings are increasing. Perhaps in the community hall, see favourable feedback since refurbishments, and the plans in place now for all venues to have consistent marketing in line with the new, easy to use one existing. Moving on to our planning system, we've obviously got 3 indicators there dealing around non-major applications dealt with in 8 weeks or week periods, and the percentage of household planning applications processed within target times. As outlined in Q1, the very significant numbers we will discuss this evening, a significant increase. Over 40% of applications received continues to now be managed proactively. Recruitment is dealing with the peak workload, and this is having a positive impact on performance in the latest period. We should have a planning enforcement reporting system in place for Q4. As outlined in our last meeting as well, just to go into customer services, the switch to 60 seconds from April in line with the state national benchmarking. That's the volume of calls taken in 60 seconds. That will see us move from the current 40-second mark. For comparison, the last month's data available, so 89% of customer services calls answered within 60 seconds or less. Moving on to household waste collections, missed twice or more in a 3-month period. Reasons can vary for this, linked to staff changes, or specific crews underperforming, which are addressed directly with teams. We understand repeat failures are frustrating residents. In-cab technology now assists the crews to be reminded and alerted to these issues. To place in a bit more context though, I think in the period, 8,000 rings collected each quarter, 39 were missed, so a very small figure, but still one the team will look to act on and decrease going forward. Housing related indicators in the report, we've got a number of households living in temporary accommodation. It was just connected to the withdrawal of COVID measures to ensure people were not evicted from their homes at the height of the pandemic. It's resulted in a knock-on increase in total number of households in temporary accommodation since Q1, primarily due to those households in priority need who were served extended notice to Brits during the pandemic. Delays to properties also being allocated for a number of weeks. Metropolitan Thamesway housing was impacted the length of time homeless households needed to remain in temporary accommodation. The company has assured the council of a reduction in numbers once this is resolved. Moving on to our higher figure then for the consequences of homelessness cases. This is now being correctly progressed to the different statutory stages of homelessness application. The trend, it's likely to continue as officers correctly progress these cases through the different stages, and therefore the figure for future months is still likely to be out of target. Percentage of applicants within bands 1 and 2 rehoused within 26 weeks. The council are below target due to a revised formula for assessing additional waiting time priority for employment and armed forces. Again, a trend likely to continue to the end of the financial year. Finally, just on robberies per thousand population of 33 in this current period, but whilst above target, it only needs, of course, that small number to make an impact. As a reminder, just for general context, the police give us the figures, and by some police, the crime commissioners sets the figures as to what we should be aiming for. They're stretching targets, they always are, but we'll endeavour to keep persisting and lowering with, amongst other things, our community safety teams campaigns. Is there anywhere, Chair, you'd like to start discussion?
Thank you very much. Very comprehensive reports. Can I just ask one question? If I can find it. You said the new enforcement policy was adopted in March 2021. With new inquiries and targets visiting sites. The report has not yet been amended to take into account the new targets. Can I ask when we're likely to get that updated report? Or do we have to wait?
Might have an update.
I've got an update, it's very positive. So I've been working with the new principal planning officer, James Bates, who's taken over responsibility for this particular area of enforcement. So we eventually had a bit of a breakthrough just after Christmas. So January the 1st was the start of Q4. So this is the Q2 data, Q3 data will still be out of target. But the Q4 data, they're now being able to process properly. So when we report in later in the year in the summer, on the Q4 data, it'll be correct from the beginning of next year.
Right, because that would be really interesting to see the impact of that enforcement policy, because obviously that's what we were looking for, the positive impact, and we'd like to see that. As I said, comprehensive report. I'm sure you've probably all got questions. Councillor Wheeler.
Okay, I mean, on the resident service, I'll cover that by report, just I know what we might cover up twice. I think financially, just pick out one example, the Walton Golf Course. So it's great to see that's actually potentially maybe break even for the first time in a long time. I think what we need to be doing now is jumping on that in terms of how we make sure we take advantage of the fact that there's been increased participation. Also, back of a horrible pandemic, that has been increased participation. We'll give examples. A few months ago, the marketing got quite a bit better than the golf courses. Emails coming out, social media posts, then some of the last few months absolutely got very quiet. You know, if you didn't find out it closed for a few days in the green, then you just announced we opened again. All the comments were, didn't they closed? So what I'm saying is there's a danger that we're going to slip back into the, I think they've just been sort of taking for granted these people are coming to go stay there. Now there's other activities back open again, people actually go back. So I think about to go to our contract officers especially and senior officers, you know, that's one of the biggest assets. Obviously great news next week, having a hotel staying there and going to be enhanced, but at the same time, because the sheer financial impact that can have on our finances, if we're going to keep subsidising that golf course, we need to be putting a lot of pressure on Glendale. I mean, I've been for years you say how terrible Glendale are, but unfortunately, you know, we are restricted, but not many other operators out there, but the best we can, we need to put that pressure on to say take advantage of increased participation and keep the ball rolling. We're just not seeing that at the minute locally. I mean, obviously, I live in Edwards, so I see it on there, and also council the area. I just don't see a bit any engagement whatsoever with the community or anyone else what they want to do going forward. So the reason I'm focused on that is just because the sheer, I know the sheer scale of that operation would be that's been in the past, and it's our biggest asset as a council. So I think just financial performance going forward will be a big help.
Sure, you.
No, I appreciate I not be no, it's just about seeing that back. I appreciate it not be there. I think just getting that record and also you know, the campus and community centre, I think obviously we know we've got some revenue from the NHS, which obviously counteracts some of the costs we have, but actually the refurbishing going there, it's going to be a lot more revenue in there going forward. So what I remember when we looked at community facilities 4 years ago, council was the second busiest centre at that time. I think actually refurbishing feedback from the community already it's really nice to see that. But I think using actually should really looking into now, as you always said, we're going to look at our facilities. Let's take advantage of people wanting to get back to sport or seeing other people again and see how we can use that. I've been working in West Park and doing everything else for our facilities. That's really push that forward. But the company expenditure and now full council will get that return as quick as possible for that aim before inflation declines. That's feedback to really go for that. So.
If you can feed all that back, do you wish to make a comment?
I can feed that back to the team that deal with the marketing side of things. So.
Oh, Councillor.
Just to follow on from that point there about community facilities, I think it's a great point. Just in your report on quality of life, page 82, page 2 out of 8, percentage of usage of community facilities, target is 50%, but the value is 25.7. Obviously, could you confirm that when that target was set, we were unsure of the work being carried out, and obviously being unknown about Gaveston continue to be used as a vaccination centre? That's right.
Yeah, it was uncertain at the time, and that figure was set. Again, as I highlighted with the new booking system, that will hopefully ensure that we've got a lot more robust focus on then being able to monitor how much communication, how much marketing is required as a result of it. But yeah, it wasn't originally set.
Okay, yeah, and that's something that we didn't know, we didn't see, understood. And just on the booking system, any ideas of when that'll go live? And what will it encompass as well? Kind of, would it be accountability, breaking it down into classes, etc.?
Yeah, it's needs to chat to my colleagues in community development, but certainly later this spring, I anticipate it will be on the cards. Again, it's geared towards having the whole marketing plan alongside it deliberately, so it's easy to do. It will be into that detail of being able to cater for a lot more of our venues, being able to cater for individual meetings of all descriptions, everything that we detailed recently in communications around very favourable initial reports for councillors refurbishment. So yeah, the whole point of the system is to get over any hurdles that we currently are presented as a result of trying to look.
Yeah, great. And I think when we come back later on in the year, it'd be great to see these metrics again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor.
Thank you. Yes, on the performance indicators, on the customers, on the perception, are people happy? And it is disappointing to see 42%, but we mustn't beat ourselves up, because I suspect, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of people who respond to these surveys only tend to respond because they've got something right, and it's their opportunity to complain. Whereas perhaps a silent majority of people just don't bother to. I mean, I'll put it to spin on the perhaps, but do you see my point? It's it's one of the things you can do is statistics, but it's kind of going back to our previous agenda item about COVID. There must be an opportunity here again to tell people, residents, what this would be doing, and that might just give some of the naysayers sort of more of an understanding as to just the challenges that everyone's faced, not least the local authorities. And also, as we all know as well, people commented here about talking about council tax and everything. Again, it's a perception thing, isn't it? At the end of the day, people look at the bank statements every month and see the council tax going out and say, but we know, and lots of people know, that the bulk of it is not. So it's another place. But of course, people respond to a survey that's saying, I don't quite know how we get that. To get that, but it's just an observation, really. So. But what do we know? I can't remember, how often do we do these surveys? Is it annual?
It's every 3 years.
Oh, it's every 3 years.
Which is the resident survey.
Right. So the next one will be for another 3 years. What time to it?
I think it's.
I can't want to just volunteer to do a survey for you.
Well, exactly.
No, it's a suggestion.
I think as we discussed last week, the community scrutiny group, it was again very much that perception versus reality around the surveys, you know that. But it is only one, as I said at the time, one snapshot of opinion. It's a very key snapshot, but it's only one snapshot. Continually, day to day, week to week, we listen to the feedback on every service that we get to all the channels, and that shapes services over time too.
I do take your point about communicating once again this piece of history to the general public, but I think possibly we need to wait for part 2, because that is the part which will actually affect the residents. So once we've got that, we need to have a bit of a fanfare. Councillor Cobb.
Thank you, Chairman. Just referring back quickly to page 87 and the satisfaction with the cleanliness and appearance of parks, open spaces, and this also relates back to our earlier conversation with Dave Banks as well. And the narrative just talk about people's increased awareness of cleanliness, but then it counters it by saying there's the increase in littering of PPE, which is really, really unfortunate and irresponsible, I think. To find a point on it. But I just wondered if an outcome of this would be whether is there a way in which we can think about yet another campaign to try and increase people's awareness of the need to reduce litter? Well, not reduce it, to cancel it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think everybody should be compelled to go and live in Japan for a month because they don't have litter bins there. The reason they don't have litter bins is because there's no litter. Because the culture is, why would anybody want to drop litter? So there isn't any. So somehow we've got to get I think we need to revitalise another, or maybe the coming out of the campaign, the pandemic, with all this PPE as litter, maybe that is a catalyst for looking at another campaign to reduce litter.
Certainly something that was very effective, the work of WISE, not just that alone. I know it's been well documented in terms of the impact that they've had on education, not just to find themselves with the education of those who dropped items. And I think it was something that was really impactful at the time was doing updates around that last year with associated communications imagery of your face mask, glove, and it really resonated with many people. So absolutely, there's another campaign there. I'm sure we can explore. It's just looking at both the WISE element of it and general education and understanding why people still deem it fit to litter anywhere in the borough.
I'd like to see emphasis on the disposal of masks and gloves in such an irresponsible way that you are actually spreading germs and virus,
Yes.
and not just to humans, but into the
wildlife.
animal kingdom.
Yeah.
Certainly ways in which that we can work with key contacts, like Fish and Wildlife Trust, etc. I'm sure that's that campaign. So I think that's the key thread that we take.
So I make Rushcliffe an exemplar.
Yeah, and also the fact that somebody, an operative, has got to pick it up.
Exactly.
And so some visual way of getting it across. You know, penny might drop.
That applies to distribution of other bodily fluids. And drivers. Yes, moving quickly on. Oh, yes, Councillor Gray.
So on the performance indicators, I think where we're not seeing ideal performance there. The narrative that we had presented before of the COVID report illustrates quite a lot of those very strongly, and so we can see the reasons for those and justifications there. I think where we perhaps might not be able to see so well is in the section where it mentions one of our registered housing providers having a systems change, which is exacerbating some of the performance indicator that we are measuring here. And I suppose my question really is around, say, our registered housing providers, where we don't have that same insight, overview, and perhaps opportunity to scrutinize. How do we scrutinize further performance within that performance indicator, perhaps indicative of other failings might be there, again, from the narrative of the pandemic that we're not quite seeing. I mean, especially considering that we're looking at our capital program to sort of put more funds towards our registered providers.
Would you like me to take that? It's a contract basis. So we have a contracts team. A lot of our contracts are dealt with in the same way. And I would suggest that what Donna would come back with if she was here this evening is saying, actually, we monitor the performance on the contract. That contract will have its own indicators in, and they get monitored through that process rather than being scrutinised at this group. It's an internal process.
Will they not go to government?
They don't go to governments now.
Well, yes, I suppose I had asked around that whether we have a service level agreement or similar on this.
You've not heard back from Donna from questions that you raised a few weeks ago.
Well, I'd heard back, but not on, but that we didn't have a service level agreement as such. So
Leave it with me.
Okay.
That's actually.
Yeah.
Right. That again was a very full and comprehensive set of reports. And we have the recommendations before us. I wonder if we could say, who's recommended corporate AV groups notes, well, notes and scrutinises. That's what we're here for, which is what we have done. Does anybody want to make comment on those recommendations? Are we happy with them?
I think just going forward, it's kind of like says words like notes.
I know.
Because we've got to be seen as we're making a decision. I understand why we have it in the other scrutiny group, so I understand why it's there. It's more just a definitive point to say we are supporting. I think more there because no, it just makes it sound like we're just sort of passing. It's almost looking at it and say, are you actually bothering to consider it? No, just means I'll have a quick look and go. What have you? So just general public perception again. I just talked about surveys about it on the language that show we are doing it seriously, so to speak.
Did we consider and agree?
Do we agree to consider to agree?
Yeah.
Sure.
Instead of noting. Agree, yeah.
Well, everybody may agree, but
Accepted.
and accept, yes. I do understand it.
The corporate overview group accepted that.
Yes.
Yeah.
A, B, C, D, blah, blah, blah,
And it
blah.
happens in all reports, across all sorts of councils, they all say the same thing. But it comes across as somewhat patronising, and you think to yourself, well, why are we here then? Isn't that what we're here for? So, yes, if you can maybe restore that wording.
Yes.
Good.
Oh, so the boys on the back row are having additional people.
No,
I'll throw them out, Jen.
Right, so we're all happy with the recommendations.
Yes.
Yes. Right. Okay. And we now move on to the feedback from the scrutiny group chairman. So if I could start with Councillor Wheeler.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. So our committee was actually last week, so I don't have to remember too far back, which is good in my memory. So there was two quite substantive items as always. And the first report was the housing and delivery plan. So we had Donna, who's our housing officer, about what we are doing the borough to how we go our delivery plan, which will be in effect from 2022 to 2027. The main challenge we've had when the government obviously, which was fantastic, in terms of giving us money to get people off the streets into the accommodations, obviously the team had to mobilise very quickly to.
Can I just say thank you, Sarah? Thank you very much. Thank you,
It's a challenge was to get those people as quickly as possible, which again was quite a challenge on the team there, but also going forward to be trying to support those people with our agencies like such as framework. And one of the biggest challenges we have going forward is the amount of people coming onto the register who need sort of housing costs. So that we that's not a lot of stock, that's not responsible for which I think some people perhaps don't understand. I think it's just metropolitan or just our house club, but actually are still responsible to make that point clear. And the issue is it's hard to forecast. It's not like know how many people on a week, month basis contact base in various times. So how many you've got to be very agile in terms of meeting that agreement. So it's been quite hard going forward. Just quite a lot of detail what the team does in terms of the what they do with various house builders when they're online, they can't fulfill their agreements out of housing. It's not looking at areas that they do have or agreeing to take responsibility, taking some. It's quite a lot of work behind the scenes to make sure we get that target of the affordable homes and the social housing we need to accommodate people. So quite a comprehensive report, and it was I think well engaged by everyone. Again, once spoken the item of about an hour and 20 minutes, if I remember correctly. So it was really much depth, and it was really not just interesting to hear, but I think just to put out exactly what we do around the housing side, because it's such a challenge, quite a small team. So we did want to record our thanks to Donna and the team for doing that, especially what they've had to go through COVID. And then the second one was around the resident PI surveys we touched on there. So I think the positive really is that 84% of people who surveyed are satisfied with the council. That's stable headline thing. We should be proud of that. It's increased on that time. What we just made absolutely clear, what feedback was around just focusing on the points where people are not happy or perhaps don't understand what we do and around our communication. So if we give example around the blind tipping, so about 45% of surveys are not I think that's nice to make open. So do they know the extensive work we're doing around with wise? Do they know how they can report wise? And I think that's some time of that. I think that from the group really was about when we're communicating people to not sort of be telling them in the sense of just a sort of report like you would see go to corporate shareholders, more engagement, reporting feedback into and look at ways to communicate. So there wasn't any criticism of anyone that we did it, we just look at how we communicate so that we understand. We just use the example we said about the council tax, which is what we touched on for quite a bit about people just think the borough council collects all the council tax and feel and spend it all. Perhaps look at that branding, do we have to have the borough council logo at the top right? We do, it's a way of creating a neutral logo, because actually those coming from us, we're doing obviously on behalf of one organisation, maybe we need to look at that branding, just people actually don't just see the borough council logo, you go, oh, it's borough council, what tax do? Just, something again to look at. It wasn't at the meeting, or something just thought of there when we were talking a while ago, but we did just talk about how we go across it. The example I gave was, as soon as the council tax comes out with the borough council, you'll see comments there, people going, well, you still can't fix my road. They'll just again, they're not obviously assume knowing that that's the county council or level body. So just around that communication side, to make sure that we tell people as much as possible. We know some people may not listen, or may choose not to listen, but just need to be out there and put the information out there in the way that people want to hear it, because social media has a big part of us. We know Russian reports is a key to a lot of part of our community, and they just look at how we adapt that going forward. So some people are quite to a strength of cycling about look at it, and some people look forward to get it. And even while we're around doing leaflets every year, you see people on their book stand on their porch, and they've actually tiled it away like a library, or it's it's on the side, or downstairs. People aren't just very straight away. So this is that. But again, just looking at how we adapt that going forwards. So again, and that was around our item. There was recommendation around sort of focus group looking forward. It was heavily debated, but I think overall, I had discussion since more just around reviewing our current actions going forwards, because the report we got was extensive in terms of feedback. I was just going forward, we do some of the action plans. We actually go right, what's going to we can scrutinise that going forward. We've obviously got 2-3 years now to get our ducks in a row, so to speak, and look at to address those points in detail. So that's been taken away back to us to look at and decide the next way going forward. So I've got a chance to come member as well, just about how we do it going forward, just to see those actions. And I think that was it for me. Shall I expound?
No, just everything said. The only one thing is obviously conversations around the focus group it's quite lengthy. I think there's probably a misunderstanding or a need for clarification amongst us councillors in terms of what that can do, what can achieve, etc. All the points, Councillor Wheeler's. Thank you.
Okay. Now we haven't got Councillor Berry. Are you able to, at a very short notice, and I'm sorry about that.
I can absolutely try my best. So I have the notes of the last meeting. So we met shortly after last meeting here and had a rather breezy session with an agenda pack, 280 pages, covering the usual from the fire hose that it's our scrutiny here, looking at. We took on the internal audit process and looking at planning in section 106 and for design and operation effectiveness. There were 3 recommendations made on that. Main financial systems were audited as well as corporate governance audit, which made a moderate rating. So again, we fared fairly well in the internal audit. Then the annual audit report was covered. So we had presentations from ZARS, and let us know that the audit was almost complete, and not aware of any matters that would require modification of the audit opinion. I think again we were given that the findings of the audit and a recommendation there, and they were also gave us an update on the value for money report, which I believe we'll be receiving in the next session. We had the statement of accounts to consider, and also the streetwise annual report. and also capital investment mid-year review. So all in all, that last one was a pretty heavy agenda. In fact, it continues to the review of investment assets also. I think quite a heavy agenda and a lot of external reports that as we know can be quite technical. But I think the group got through fairly well. Looking ahead to this week, we're back in for another update with the internal audit progress report, and also a look at our internal audit strategy, along with capital investment strategy and risk management. I think again on our internal audit, we have I think 2 moderate and 1 sort of one of the best ratings you have on that. So we're progressing very well on the internal audit. And so that in terms of strategy and risk management, just a quick look for this. Again, I think we're looking back on some of the progress on risks identified with regards to COVID-19, and also there are, I think, a couple of reds on there, but there was some disagreement. Just have a, so I think there was some disagreement with the perceived risk, and actually when that was reported externally and what we thought in terms. Yeah, that's the comment.
Thank you very much. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chairman. The Growth and Development Scrutiny Group, we met last week, and the 2 items. One was a tree conservation, where we had a presentation from the officers, tree officer. We support the recommendations, but we added, as a result of the scrutiny, we added some additional items. The 2 main original ones were we supported the drafting of the tree protection policy and tree management policy, and secondly, we supported the investigation into feasibility of an online mapping system to map where protected trees are in the borough. But as a result of the conversation, we added on to the drafting of the tree protection policy and the tree management policy to include a review of how we appraise planning applications in relation to looking at the subject of tree protection. And then we had a separate additional recommendation to actually strengthen the protection and enforcement policy, to look at how we can do that. Coupled with as a result of the conversation, we also agreed that we would write to government, basically to DEFRA, to talk about the fact that the legislation around tree preservation orders is mainly aimed around the aesthetics and the looks of a tree, in particular from the public realm, as opposed to it doesn't talk about its environmental benefits at all. And it was explained to us that there was nothing in the legislation that supported that additional looking at other factors apart from just the look and the health of a tree. So we wanted to write to the government to ask the Secretary of State to look at the legislation around tree preservation orders to include environmental aspects and biodiversity, and to include in that as well the protection of hedgerows, not just trees, but the fact that there were so many hedgerows being decimated around the countryside, and that's a very important factor in support of biodiversity. And the other item we mentioned was a secondary or supplementary item in relation to cycling. The first meeting that took place, it was taken up principally by presentations, so very little time for discussion. So this was more about a summary of that previous meeting and then a discussion, which we then agreed that we would include walking and cycling in the scope of any future actions from the council. Primarily that would relate to planning, but not necessarily limited to planning. And also we approved the walking and cycling plan, which it was all contained within one page, and that included factors such as promotion and awareness, safety and infrastructure, various items contained within that. And what I've just said about the previous meeting was taken up by presentations, tried in this meeting we just had, particularly in relation to the trees. I asked that we have a shorter and more condensed presentation from officers, which allowed, and as far as I'm going to ask Councillor Butler to make any comments he wishes in a moment, but I think that helped because it promoted much more discussion, questioning, challenging, finding out, and I think it led to a more fruitful conversation and led to other things being added, in my view, which is what scrutiny is about, and helped towards making it a more interesting meeting. And I think that it would be useful if we try and concentrate on persuading presentations to be, if not short, broken up, to allow more interaction and toing and froing and more conversations with members, because it did bring out more interesting things.
No, really just to agree and confirm the tree presentation in particular was broken down into sections, and what Councillor Clark says, it seemed to flow better. There was more of a discussion going on sort of two-way between members and officers, and so I think that's possibly a lesson learned. The old cliche sort of not so much death by PowerPoint, not too many slides. It was good. It was better. Just one other thing on the cycling strategy, we had a discussion as well, because on the same day as our meeting last week, there was news about the highway code changes and the sort of way they're prioritising the vulnerability of things. Road users, and it was noted that pedestrians and cyclists are sort of high on the list of priorities, so the committee was quite interested. Speculating to see how that works.
Yes, I came and observed that meeting, and I had already said to the officer that I thought there were some really good demonstrations of good scrutiny in that meeting, which I'm hoping we might be able to use within the training programme. And certainly the shorter presentations, if I might say, if an officer has given the report, as we've had here, there shouldn't be any need to actually almost read that report, paragraph by paragraph. We've done that. It should be a question of just summarise it, and if you've got questions, I'm here to answer. And that then leaves room for the purpose of the meeting, which is scrutiny, to ask those questions. And I think that happened at your meeting. That was really good. Obviously, no one else can comment because they weren't at that meeting unless they watched.
I'm sure they've been watching it on YouTube every evening.
It's on the list.
It's on the list.
I won't say where
Netflix.
Must be into double figures.
You're getting a box set, are you? Right, that leads us to the lead officers report.
Very much, Chairman. So just two pieces of feedback from me. December, just before Christmas, saw the last East Midlands Council Scrutiny Network meeting. I was expecting to go and talk about the impact of COVID on councils and expecting that to be really informative and to help with the item possibly we discussed earlier this evening. It actually was a discussion about the impact of COVID on scrutiny meetings, which was somewhat out of date as far as we were concerned, because whilst we had some very initial impact with meetings being postponed, if you can remember back to early 2020, we did pick those up when we got to the summer. We had extra meetings in place. We didn't drop any of our items and we carried on as normal as soon as we had the virtual arrangements up and running. So that was not a particularly useful discussion, unfortunately. What we did have was a presentation without slides from Ed Hammond, who you may remember from the Centre of Public Scrutiny and Governance, and they've changed their name now, about the future face of scrutiny. Now, his views, interestingly, were that the relationship between councils and the public is changing, and that post-pandemic, he's expecting greater engagement in democracy, but formally with meetings. There must be something good on telly tonight. And also informally with the community-based action, I think we can probably understand. One thing that he was keen to stress, and it might be something that you want to consider moving forward, is post-pandemic scrutiny, i.e. how have things changed and are we still delivering the right services in the right way? Is it what our community needs? And he also, of course, made reference to an uncertain future, which I think we can all understand in terms of levelling up, health and care bill, environment bill, new planning legislation, and such like. There is lots of change coming, so it's not like things are going to get quiet. So the next meeting is on the 11th of March, and as soon as I've got an agenda, I'll make sure that I circulate it to you. You're more than welcome to attend. They are virtual at the moment, so it's not like we have to go herring around the county, which we've done in the past. The only other item I wanted to mention was the scrutiny training, which we discussed at the last meeting. Now, we did have a plan in place to deliver a sort of 45-minute session before the two meetings that were held last week and governance this week. Obviously, when the government put plan B in place, Christmas, high Omicron cases, we decided to take the foot off the pedal there just to focus on what was really important. So what we're planning to do is move to one session, which we're hoping to hold at the end of this month. And I know that Helen has circulated a date of the 23rd of February to you to check your availability before we go out to wider officers. So we're currently putting the content together on that.
What day of the week is it?
Do you know, I
So
really don't know.
Is that
It's
full
Wednesday.
council? It's full council county and we won't be back.
We won't be doing it that day, will we?
Will we, oh, the budget will they
It's
tell?
Wednesday.
It's on a Wednesday.
Oh, Wednesday, sorry, it's the 24th of council, Wednesday, okay.
So we're on.
Yeah, sorry, yeah,
Okay.
they'll consolidate, it's fine.
I
It
was
would be
asking.
helpful if you could get back to Helen on that one and we'll put something in the diary. I think the focus of that, Councillor Cumberlack and I have been discussing, is about listening, questioning skills, techniques, and how you prepare for scrutiny. And hopefully we'll be able to not only perhaps use some examples of good scrutiny taking place, and we've got the function of being able to use video. I've been on the hunt for other authorities doing good scrutiny as well, but also perhaps a pretend scrutiny item that you can help prepare questions for in small groups. So coming back to your point, Councillor Clark, about making things a bit more interactive. And that's all.
Sorry, is that supposed to be in the arena or virtual?
It hasn't been decided yet, so I'd appreciate your views on whether you think councillors would be more comfortable with virtual.
I think you'll
or
get higher
in-person.
participation virtual, and much I like having it in person further, I think something like that where you struggle for attendance usually. Especially perhaps in the evening.
I'm sure officers can turn their hands to both.
Like you, I just think you'll get higher participation, which that you know, I just much I like to say.
Yeah, you tend to get better attendance if it's virtual. But I think training would be better delivered face to face.
I agree,
But
training
how
point best
you
face
get
to
that
face.
interest,
Well,
I don't know.
Unless we go out and ask people what you prefer and actually see what we get the higher response, you see a lot more votes online, and that's what we go with. I just think you'll see, I understand especially people coming from far across the county, especially with the roadworks coming up the two as well, everything else, that part of it, I just think. Whereas full council people know they have to be there, let's be honest, you know, or coming to maybe it's training like they know what we can do something. I don't blame it because there's a lot going on at the moment, so it's online, not making it easy just for the current circumstances.
Circulate everybody else their preference.
Alternatively, it's something we can do online at the moment and perhaps repeat in the future. We'll have the material, but next time we do it, it's an in-person session.
Honestly, if you know it's going to be full council conference, agenda, you know, just what you can see visual, but I know,
That's not happening anytime soon.
I know, but you know, later in the year as well, like a refresh, just a half hour. Refresh your
We're
rotation.
trying to make it more punchy, fun, not so PowerPoint and tedious and.
We're also hoping to get the
somebody's
coffee
voice.
machine working, if that helps.
Oh.
Trade of biscuits is going from like the car park down to here.
That was my instruction last week, and I went back to Peter and I said, because you think that will make them come to training? He went, no, but at least they'll
We're
stay
like
awake.
geeks about that, aren't we?
We
Can
can do something.
I just, your information, mentioned there must be something good on telly tonight. Well, actually, talking about training, there's a government training programme on telly tonight. It's called Yes Minister. That's where everybody is.
Absolutely relevant.
Yeah, always have to watch.
That's the sort of advice I get when I ask, what do you think about this? That sort of response.
I think the person on my right is the best imitation of someone.
We don't have time.
Right, so that is, thank you very much. You've completed your feedback.
Yes, I have.
Lovely. So we now move on to consideration of the group work programme and the matrices that have been presented to us. It's best if we look at the matrices first, I think, and then look at the work programme. And the first one in my agenda, may not be the same for anybody, is the ownership of public open spaces. Now, I've got a question to ask. There's a concern in here about the ownership of some of these public open spaces, these open spaces. And this could mean that they're commercially owned. In which event, I'm not quite sure how the council deals with that. And whether we actually have agreements.
But then chance for a management company, like example at Sharp Hill, so you've got the land where the management company's got the responsible for it. I think from reading Councillor Thomas's question, what the concern is, there might not be a protection of that land management company down the line to say we're going to suddenly put two houses there, we're going to do something else with that space. But what protection we put in place to say, yes, you're responsible for that land, but responsible for maintaining its current form, not sticking 5 extra houses up.
We had a problem, didn't we? Was it Ganston? Or Compton?
Well, council had the issue with the respect, that was because there was no agreement in place. That was
the grass cuts.
Yeah, because the state was done on appeal and no section 1 was put in place. That was different where there was no agreement. Just builders just did it, to be fair to them, for 20 years without having to, and some decided they weren't going to or one build. So, but this is now a place where management company has to be established or it's transferred. It's either transferred to some to work, so it's management company are responsible for it in form. But give an example of Sharp Hill, they're on the second management company, that's why the third management company for one part of it already, second for another part. So when concern is from residents, I'm not sure the same easily, I don't know, but being concerned from residents is, well, what protection have we got going forward, so whoever takes on next, what they're going to do with it. So I think it's good, I don't know how it relates to the current planning policy, to be honest, I don't know that factor with this. So what impact we have, but it's good, I see what we can do to impact going forward. So I do think it's definitely Eric Sunny see what it sounds to me. I know it is in airports as well. I'm saying
it's just a question of how we scrutinise it, because transfer talks in here about the same page, transferring a land to a residents association or transferring to anybody. Still doesn't mean that they could still apply to build houses on it. So I think it's more about trying to understand within the planning legislation how you place, for want of a better expression, a covenant or some legal covenant onto that land that protects it in perpetuity for that community space.
The council was just referred to asset community value. I know there's certain bylaw criteria to do that. I don't know whether how that would impact if it would qualify that kind of space. I don't know. It's on my head, but there's quite a lengthy procedure to go through. So that's why, like I say, council says what we can do if that is the viable option. But if it isn't, what other options we have as council to do?
I mean, we've already looked at open spaces. This has already been scrutinised earlier.
It did, yeah. I just wondered whether it's possible to, well, I realise obviously the planning department is inundated at the moment, but whether we could have asked for some form of briefing note as to what the legislation is and what protection there is or can be given to pieces of land to ensure that they are retained as those open spaces.
Again, Chairman, sorry, there's on the first paragraph of Councillor Forrest, the last line is an early scrutiny item discussed charges for management of public open space on your estate. The issue of ownership of land of these and older estates was not scrutinised. So I wasn't there.
Well, yeah, she's right. That's the actual ownership. It was mentioned in passing that we didn't go into the ownership.
Just say that obviously that wasn't scrutinised, the topic maybe, but not the actual level of that detail, just to give that context.
Yeah, well, the previous item related more about scrutinising the way in which open space was managed and safeguarding a hike in the fees and that sort of thing. That was sort of what
It's a different topic, though, the same topic, it's different, but angles are on work. There's a different
angle,
focus.
Yeah.
It was about work.
Oh, it is, yeah. But as the officer's appraisal was saying at the end, it's an awful lot of work. I just wonder whether there is some way in which a planning officer can just outline the basic principles of the legal status of a piece of open land and how it can be safeguarded to avoid it being built on.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So, because to be honest, that's a general question anyhow. You could almost ask that in every time we have the planning committee and a big development comes in, we can ask that question every time.
Absolutely, and of course, the standard reply will be that where you can't speculate as to what might happen in the future, and if any application comes in the future for the community lands built on, then it will be discussed as a plan.
Which doesn't safeguard.
Doesn't safeguard.
No, it's,
I think briefing idea is probably more realistic.
Well,
Yes, no.
do we think in the first instance we should be doing that, asking planning department whether they can provide us to answer that question?
But they also say they haven't got the time, as we heard, the answer to respect that, said that they're going to say they want the items, so they compromise is to get that information.
I think we should try and do something.
yeah, so I think probably the response to Councillor Thomas is regrettably the amount of work involved will be unrealistic or disproportionate or whatever. However, we recognise that it is something that needs to be talked about, and therefore we're asking the planning officers to provide a briefing note on the legal status of open spaces.
Can I just clarify then, so that a briefing note, I think that's a good idea. I'm not sure the planning team will have time just to vote. So as long as you haven't got a particular set deadline by which you need to have it, I will obviously try my best.
Tomorrow lunchtime will be fine.
The other thing is that what you're asking for is a briefing note that outlines the legislation and what protection can be given to open spaces to ensure they're kept in public use. Not necessarily a briefing note that answers all of Councillor Thomas's points.
No,
Because I
no,
think we're looking at 6 months worth of work.
no, I'm focusing on the legal status of an open space and how it can be protected legally.
And that covers the broad part of the items, isn't it?
Are we,
And then
Councillor Johnson?
would we go back to Councillor Thomas and say, this is what we're going to do? And does this meet your expectations? Chances are, for the moment, yes, but could then there be an opportunity to say, look, I think you're right, you know, there's a lot of work to do, but do you want to prioritise a home in or?
I always go back to councillors that submit a matrix and tell them, oh, I've already been in touch with Councillor Johnson, said this is our recommendation, and I did that before the papers were published, so she was aware. I will go back to her later this week and say that this is what, if you didn't catch what councillors discussed, this is the premise of the discussion, this is what we're going to do going forward. Now, within the scrutiny matrix, it very clearly says that we don't look at items of a similar nature within a 2-year period. That means that Councillor Thomas still feels that this is an important issue and the briefing note and the intervening time haven't actually answered her concerns. She's perfectly within her rights to bring it back before this committee as another scrutiny matrix, even exactly the same later next year, which will be 2 years after it was initially discussed.
Also, it's odd, because it's not something exactly unique to Rush Clip, where it's international parts. So maybe we're seeing the context where that's happened somewhere else. There's sort of similar inquiries we made, and we were go through the local government department or connections that they are have across Australia Hill, because they just can't be unique here. It's just amount of developments that are going on with similar all across the country, especially around share. Maybe we'll be able to help them out. Why not? They have to read note from scratch.
Right. Okay, now we move on to tree preservation order register should be made public and placed online.
Automatically check now.
And I think.
Well, actually, I'm hoping that we've partially done
It
this
sounds like you did it.
at the last, because that's pretty much what we
did.
agreed to do. So we've actually foresaw.
That
what
service
you were
with a
going
smile, isn't it?
I shall be writing more scrutiny matrices.
Yes, the telepathy was there.
We got all the minutes, meetings, right, guy, you go.
Hey, that was quick, wasn't it?
It was, yes, yeah,
Got some action.
Next.
Right, okay, so we'll move on then to the establishment of Rushden Community Council, which came up with full council, didn't it? And I think Councillor Wheeler's been working with Councillor Jones on this.
Yeah, I mean, I know we talked about lengthening council, just it's something that we. I think the whole full council, I think, agreed in principle, the establishment of new council, obviously, the item just to, with the argument just to make it a bit more broad, really. I really understand how councillor came about to start with. I've had a lot of conversations with him to get this sort of right, and I think it's something we should be absolutely looking to do, because as we said before, I think it was the argument of full council and everything else, but we need to get more engagement from our residents. Actually, young people, perhaps we haven't got that engagement. We talk about resident survey, how many young people would have filled out that survey? It's going way hard yet. So let's get those views in. These people are going to be our taxpayers in the future, and for the fellow council sat here, let's get that engagement now, and make sure we're getting really range of views from everyone across the world, whether you're at school or not been in school for a long time.
I agree with you, so I do think we really need to get those schools on board, because I think those young people will be really interested, provided schools are actually working with them and telling them. That is the problem. I've been involved with this type of group and tried to work with the school at Building. They were not going to work with it.
Well,
So-
I mean, virtually every school has a new council, which is, especially primary school level, because we've got 6 schools in my county, and so it's really good. There's a basis there, which you need to coordinate that together, which is what this council do to get those range of opinions, and secondary schools as well. We know we have the young project that's only say one child for every school, so it's not broad range of use, it's that one, which is obviously valid, but still want to get that more input. So we've got the basis there, not we're going to completely reinvent the wheel, we don't have to, it's building on this foundation, so it should be hopefully everyone's got that engagement to get that going as soon as possible.
Okay, so that one's going forward. The alternative energy and emerging technologies. Which Councillor Clark forward. I'm slightly confused, if I'm honest. In the officer's resources and the recommendation, they almost seem to contradict each other.
I think, isn't it saying that there aren't sufficient officers within the organisation to do it, and if we did it, it would involve bringing in additional external resource in, and the question then is that value for money in terms of how much is that going to cost? It's one of those awkward things, because I think it does need looking at, because there are lots of criteria and a lot of impact of alternative energy, which I'm not sure is fully taken into account in planning applications, and wanted to try and find out more as to how things were taken into account and whether we take everything into account, i.e. as I've listed, the impact on the environment, etc., etc., etc. You know, there are lots of factors involved, especially, thankfully, well, this was an application drawn, but certainly I know in the north of the county, there are two enormous, I mean enormous, involving tens of thousands of solar panels, tens of thousands. So they cover acres or hectares and hectares and hectares. That has to have an environmental impact, and are things like that fully, haven't got the capacity to fully take into account that sort of thing. But I do just worry a little bit about bringing external resources in.
Nothing here which tells us how much.
No, because at the moment we don't know how much it costs, because we haven't looked into it before you've made the decision. One thing I would say, it's not just about capacity. This is a very specialist subject, and because it's emerging, actually, we don't feel our officers are best placed. So you're bringing in somebody who's really got the front expert ideas, and you can advise.
That's a different kettle of fish.
Yeah. So what we're proposing actually with this is that there is an opportunity for members of scrutiny to put forward their concerns. We'd like to know about this. We don't understand that. And then the work would go away and be done, but be fed back through the LDF group, which is the right place for it. And it comes out as a supplementary planning document rather than necessarily something that then comes back through scrutiny. So scrutiny kick it off as something that we do, but actually if we're going to pay for somebody to come and do it, let's have an output at the end of the day, which is we can then adopt through forecast.
Without wishing to step on your toes, so to speak, but what is the role of Russia? Because most of these applications are dealt with by the county, energy facilities, such like that. So they consider it.
Well, what? Wind turbines,
solar farms, the emerge facility, that sort of thing.
So our role there is to give a recommendation.
Yes, so we are consultees on
so counties are so.
yeah.
Come to borough as well, don't they?
Well, the borough will be asked for opinion. The borough will be a consultee, but it's not the final decision.
Well, there's solar farms out at the sea that Andy Brown did. His applications. Yeah.
Well, I thought the anaerobic digester allowed to.
I'm the anaerobic barrier.
Oh, it's late, I think. But certainly, most of your energy applications are usually kept.
Not confusing with
No, I'm not.
I suspect it's over a certain
Because we did if you go to the emerge application, that was a
Is what getting the prices, so we bring this item back, the scrutiny matrix back to next meeting to get the information about the cost and
who works
Well, I think what has been explained is that what we're doing now is this is discussed at scrutiny,
Yeah.
and as a result of that, we then go out if we think that's right to do to an expert.
What we're looking to do is to give you a forum where you can air your
Yes.
concerns that then officers will take away and feed into some piece of work that results in a supplementary planning document through which we will probably end up bringing in some kind of expert consultant. What we're not looking to do is bring an expert consultant in to tell you all about alternative energies. That's not what we're planning to do. Don't think that would be helpful.
We had a, when we brought it out, we called it the Vale of Beaver wind turbine strategy. We worked with Melton District Council, and that was quite productive, but it was a group. And we don't know, this discussion might send us down the road like that, don't we?
It's also worth seeing the Greater Gloucestershire strategy that we have with the other councils, where it's something that maybe do as a joint effort, maybe they'll put something in towards one. It's something that would go to affect, say, not just the councils across, maybe have that JPAL, isn't it? Correct, Roger Upton. Yeah, something like that. We don't know Roger's.
Planning.
That's the one. Yeah, I'll say is, but I know that Roger's on one there. Whoever feed that back in, see whether something like joint projects, it might just take some of the cost off this, but it's that document, because we've done that, would obviously benefit them as well as ourselves.
In the first instance, are we agreed that the discussion form process comes to scrutiny for us to then move it on? We think that there are areas we should have moved on to. It is very much emerging technology, and I do think this council, we've just proved it earlier, has been very well armed when it came to the pandemic. We really should be well armed when it comes to future technology.
Yep.
Okay, so that one goes forward. Oh, right, yeah.
Half the
A
council.
nice topic here. Sewage. So, boys?
That's the second warning. I think it should be at least attempted at the end of it.
I'm agreeing with your valuable decision.
Yeah.
One of you will be in the corridor.
The camera doesn't stretch that far.
Oh, no. Right, yes. Yes, sewage infrastructure and Ms. Gerald in Rushcliffe. Somebody want to talk about that, or we're going to flush it down the middle?
Well, yeah, we need to be delving in far more to how the sewage infrastructure copes with, when we have an awful lot of additional housing development, and the answer we always get as a planning committee, as an example, if we say, oh, yes, so there's an extra 500 houses here, what's going to happen? What's the arrangements for dealing with the extra sewage? And there's just a stock answer, oh, that's up to Severn Trent to make sure they've got enough facility. And then the 500 houses get built, and you find that it's still exactly the same facility as before the 500 houses were built. And now there's sewage coming up in the roads and wherever. And so we need, in my view, I think we should be looking far more at how Severn Trent approaches the demand for additional sewerage infrastructure, and is there something extra that we could be lobbying government for to get extra powers to say, well, it's no good just to say, oh, well, it's up to Severn Trent to supply the extra facility. The fact that we should be, as a planning authority, saying, there's another 3,000 houses being built there. One of the conditions needs to be that whoever is responsible needs to ensure that Severn Trent is providing the additional infrastructure such that it will not start backing up and flooding.
Yes, the Severn Trent and the League flooding authorities do comment on the larger housing developments. When it comes to a development within a village of 5 or 6 houses, where the infrastructure's been there since Adam was a lad, they turn around and say, oh, well, it's, we have nothing to comment. In other words, it's not big enough for us to make a comment. Well, for a small village, those 5 or 6 houses are quite a big impact. And it happened, which is why I'm part of this, happened in Hickling, and 5 times came up in the pub, in the dining room, which is very nice, and turned out to be a problem of Severn Trent.
It was only on the 5th time that
Yeah.
Severn Trent finally admitted that it was their problem, because they tried to say it wasn't their problem.
You've built houses and used this old infrastructure. And
Sounds to me the scrutiny, like I say, it's a lot of ambiguity and it's a big problem. I know recently seen the pictures and videos, Secretary of Various Council running down the high street, so to speak, there's a station there. So what examples you're giving, you absolutely need to find out more. Because it does seem quite mad where every other body has to give their, you know, what exactly they're going to do on the sector agreements, then we just say, oh, they'll deal with it. So I'll be fine to say exactly what. Yeah.
Can I just say, in with the appraisal of officer resources, yes, it's not a topic under the Borough Council direct control, but there is some participation with other agencies, and although it's not under the direct control, there's no reason why an outcome may possibly be, as I indicated, that we end up lobbying government to say we need a change in legislation in order to make improve things.
because we asked these other agencies to act as consultees, but if we're not getting consultation, then we aren't fulfilling our duties of the planning authority.
Yes, as well, Chairman. I mean, it does say to go to community, which obviously no problem with, but it does sound to me it's more growth development item.
It's one of those ones
Yeah.
that could
Yeah.
go
No, no, yeah.
both ways.
Obviously, yeah,
So
just
it's
like I
entirely
said,
up to you.
Oh, yeah. Well, when we look at the work programme, see where we push it. We're all in agreement it goes forward.
Yes, yeah.
Then we've got the access agreement between RBC and the Canal and Rivers Trust. This comes up every so often, because RBC contribute to the towpath, the leisure corridor. But in the light of COVID, I think they need to widen that scope, because it has that Grantham Canal has proved a lifesaver for many people, and it would appear that one of the things that they enjoy and has been scientifically proven that the benefits of water are wonderful for mental health. So I think that agreement needs widening to maybe encompass help with the maintenance of the water. However, it has to come to us because it is an agreement which has to be renewed, so it has to come to scrutiny. So
Yeah, absolutely, definitely.
Yeah. And it's not just the water advantages of Grantham Canal, it's the general lie of the land, the condition of the footpaths, towpaths.
Well, the tow part is part of the agreement.
Yeah,
That is the agreement.
yeah.
But I think it needs, scope needs extended.
The feedback is as well, Charles, because I used to, well, I was a representative of Bradford Canal, just thanks to the horrible old business manager at the county council, but I know they've got some big agreements and some big plans in place what they want to do in terms of going forwards. So they want to open it back up, basically the whole stretch, which we're talking millions of pounds and where they get the money from. I think part of that agreement, just understand what the plans are, because that agreement could dramatically change if the plans come. Not see how they will, but if they do come off, then that agreement, like I say, would be out of date as soon as it starts. We just need to understand that, how that work, and whether we can put in members of clauses that the agreement would have to come back as well. Yeah, I do. I don't know if you've seen those plans, but I've seen just with my other hats on that sort of stuff. I've heard that before.
So if we can now look at the actual work programmes. Corporate overview group 1 is fairly standard. We have the second tranche of the COVID-19 on the 3rd of May. And then I'm assuming these provisional dates, put in provisional dates, I'm assuming that is because they've not been with the new council here.
Yes, the calendar of meetings gets agreed at annual council at the end of May. So whilst we have provisional dates, will probably be all agreed. Calendar's never been pushed back. However, we will still call them provisional dates until that.
And does that account for why on the individual group work programmes, they don't appear to be there on their agendas?
Not yet, no, but they probably will be at the next round of meetings.
Also, we've heard back as well, wasn't Chairman, that was actually better not to touch it on there as it comes through the group, because the issue I had with my group was that people were so that we were showing work programs. It'll all been changed around here and go, well, what's the point of screening work program when you got to change it anyway? So I think I actually like the new format where it's just literally the next meeting was virtually agreed to look, or even potentially these are the items going forward to corporate group to discuss what are your thoughts, so we can get that feedback as representative of our agreement there. After that, because obviously we're here as their representatives as well. To get that
On
feedback.
that point, it's worth mentioning, Chairman, that Laura and Maisie today have been working on populating. So on ModGov, there's actually a tab that says forward plan. Now, we've only ever had the Cabinet and Council forward plans on there, but actually we're putting the scrutiny forward plans on there as well. So it should be a lot easier for people to see what's on your work programmes going forward.
Because the other point is that previous COG meetings, we've agreed work programmes and we've put things in certain dates. And in particular, we've pushed back conservation areas on several occasions. And I'm just anxious because it says provisional date on 27th of July for the conservation area part 2, that this is going to get itself pushed back again. And it really can't move again.
It's not that the meetings won't take place, it's that the dates are provisional until they go through annual council.
But it's 99.9% in agreement, like I said, Charles.
Well, I was just going to say, one must never assume that it's fair to assume that these dates will be.
We'll propose an amendment now, just so Charlotte starts framing.
I'm just worried that some people might pick that up. Because the agendas aren't available. I might pick that up and might put it out. Why is that being? Right, now the governance scrutiny group, with slight alterations in code of conduct from February meeting.
I think fit more into that 19th of May.
Sorry?
So I think we could fit more into that 19th of May meeting.
Well, the code of conduct's been moved on the basis that it only went through standards meetings this week, so there wasn't enough time
Get 5 more
to
items.
allow
in now,
them to
then.
discuss it and make any changes before it came to governance.
Right. Okay.
I would like to just point out there's a mistake on there, Chairman, so apologies for that. The provisional date for governance in September is the 15th, not 21st. Otherwise, it would be the same night as drugs. We can't do that.
Oh, well, we can try. That'll make for an interesting
Try our
discussion.
patience as our listeners to do 2 meetings in one.
15th September, that's the Battle of Britain Day. It'll be quite a battle there then.
Right, growth and development. We talked about the alternative energies and that, so it's gone in for 21st of September. And that one's all right.
Provisionally, yes.
Yeah, planning commission communications is there as a single item, because we reckon it's going to take up the whole meeting.
Yeah.
The conservation area is part 2. Are we saying that that's going to take up the whole meeting?
Not especially, not in the way that we expect planning communications to. However, the reason that we scheduled the alternative energies for September is to allow sufficient time. Now, if you are looking at just a general debate where councillors can put their views forward, I don't actually see any reason why that shouldn't go with conservation areas. And it's perfectly within your rights to move that forward, because there isn't any reason why you shouldn't, given what we've discussed this evening and how that scrutiny item will pan out at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, was it just the sewage that we extra? Oh, we haven't decided which one that's going in, yes.
But would it be ready for 27th July from scratch?
If it is just an opportunity for councillors to put forward their concerns and views, so it's a general debate. I don't see a particularly in-depth report coming from officers or any kind of presentation for that matter. It's a very different kind of scrutiny item to the ones that we normally consider, given that what we're doing is saying, just have a roundtable discussion so you get all your concerns out. What do you want this piece of work to do? That then planning team can take that away, employ a consultant, as you say, perhaps see if other councils are interested in going halves or quarters on that piece of work. And then
So was that the overall, I think it's the sewage one, was that the overall planning? Sewage one was on, if I remember the comments from the officers, was that they basically want Severn Trent to come on, yeah. So that's what I was talking about, yeah, I was saying that ready for July, yeah, I think that was the item on the merging alternative energy, wasn't it? Yeah,
sorry, that's what.
No, it's just, like I say, I think from the officer comment on sewage one will be whether they can get engagement from Severn Trent and do the internal drainage board and
We
other
think
partners.
we can. We think that Severn Trent are interested in coming and raising their profile, and certainly coming and talking to councils is one way of doing that. So we're positive from that point of view, that as long as they've got support that they need, the right people at the right time and can make the meeting, that they will be willing to do that.
So if they can do that date, then that probably makes sense to do it. So then, to be from the communities one to the 27th of July development, if those parties say they can make that date.
Yeah.
Sorry, councillor Wheeler, are you proposing that we leave alternative energies in September and move sewerage from communities to growth and development?
Or what, can I just, you've got September for alternative energy, you'd like to see waiting on, get some more information in time.
I actually think it might be easier to move alternative energy sources forward to July, and then potentially, if you want sewerage to go to growth and development rather than communities. To
I'm happy to have a community, I just think because the overall topic sounds like more growth than item, I've got no problem with saying communities, but sounds more like ties more growth development.
It sort of tends to relate to planning application more, doesn't it?
It is about development and planning, isn't it?
Yeah, so move alternative energies to July and put sewage into September.
Oh, was just one question I wanted to ask. When you print certainly the chairman's agenda, we have a recommendation of continuation? Always used to be, otherwise, particularly when I look at upside down. Coming backwards and forwards. Find it. And yes. If I
Have we actually done
can I have it right way up?
We didn't
Done
do communities
communities.
before.
Haven't done.
Communities.
Oh, we just, oh, sorry, we would.
We've taken stuff off it.
Yeah.
We've
So
taken
if
some-
it's come off it, we get a few months off now. There you go, done, very done.
Brilliant, I agree.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, I was thinking that we discussed it, we were discussing it all in one, yes.
The main thing is the carbon map, the waste strategy, where we also depend on the governments with that, and we're not very hopeful with everything going on, but that's gonna be ready in time. So if it's not what we propose, what our group proposes, that sports development comes forwards. That's already been laid twice anyway, and they're always fine with it. Then waste strategy would move back to July if, you know, we'll just wait till we go.
Hasn't been delayed, it was a new item at the last agenda.
Okay, so the way Brexit was delayed, wasn't it? Yeah, sorry.
No, I think if you look back at your papers, we discussed it at the last meeting. just
Yeah, I
before
can remember, I
Christmas.
just think you
So
complained
the
it'd be
reason
delayed
you
twice,
got
if I remember, that's, yeah, it's
No.
delayed twice, okay.
Fair enough.
You can send a strong word email to him, I'm sure you'll love that, but no.
I would suggest that actually, if waste strategy is not ready to come forward for an update and the group doesn't feel they need one at this stage, your carbon management plan is sufficient enough of an item to really keep going for the entire meeting anyway.
Well, probably it's like I say, just about, you know, looking at the odd things, and more things they're covering the matrix, obviously, there's already still next two meetings filled, and we know that we also get quite a lot from the matrix, more than happy to, because what's event, we've covered part of it in a sense with the community facilities, that's general, so it's not like it's brand new, we're 100%, I think we could probably squeeze that, we could do a report on that, like I say. I don't think it would have
Whilst
to be-
you may feel that you can squeeze it in, I'm pretty certain the officers don't feel they can have it prepared by that.
Okay, if they can't, they feel it's not ready, that's fine, but same one item there, they're not ready for it, okay.
That's a
And
nice
unless you
spot as
want
well.
particular
Yeah.
people to implode with the amount of work they need to do, I'm afraid we
Absolutely
really
not.
do need to.
Well, we already saw our waste strategy, if it's not ready, we'll have a verbal quick update, we can't imagine how absolutely we can, like you say, it could last for, the last one lasted about an hour, so it's, like I said, there's probably room for something else if we need to, if there were small items we need to. Do that.
So if waste isn't ready by then, we'll push it out to the next one or the one after.
Yes, well, it'll be pushed back till basically when we get, it's all depending on government, to be honest,
We're in
yeah.
the lap of the gods with that one because we don't know when we're going to have the information that we need to move that forward. It's not in our control.
You know, because with the levelling up paper come out tomorrow, that's one of the big ones before that, so you'd hope that'd be next Sunday, yeah, but hope and logic is. I want to go with that one, God knows when it'll come out, but yeah.
Okay, are we all happy with that? Thank you, and thank you all for coming tonight, and when you hear about the training, spread the word, please, because it is very important. The meeting the other night really showed how councillors can actually make a difference. And I don't think, a lot of the councillors who I don't think really understand what asking those pertinent questions at these meetings means and how they get carried forward on policies. So, wow.
Okay.